Welcome to the Neurodiversity in the Workplace podcast. We here at Neurodiversity in the Workplace are a team of neuroinclusion consultants that work with businesses trying to build more inclusive, accessible, and equitable systems, practices, and culture in their organization. And our team of consultants generally meets on a weekly basis to debrief on current engagements, learn from each other's trials and errors, things that we've observed from our partners, things that are working, and where we're trying to take our efforts and move the needle. And we wanted to create this show to share some of what we are talking about and what we're learning with the broader community. So that brings us to today, and we have Charles here, who's going to share with us a learning example from a past partner, and we'll kind of talk through their experience and what we learned from that and how we take that into our practice more broadly. So Charles, why don't you walk us through?
Appreciate that introduction, Sean. So this particular partner that we were working with had a recent hiring event, and the key takeaway as a result of that hiring event was you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So this is a Fortune 500 company, pretty robust internship program. So we're hiring several internship roles, and then they are in the STEM field, so some six-figure STEM jobs as well for a couple of full-time hires. Only were targeting 4 roles, but ended up getting 5 hires because one of the groups, there were 2 candidates that they couldn't turn down the silver medalist, so they carved out a role for them as well. So really good result from the hiring event. And what was interesting was we had replaced the traditional behavioral style interview that was the default for most of the business units at this company with our version of a skill-based hiring process. So it was broken up into 2 parts where the candidates came in and did a 30-minute, what we call candidate showcase, where they talk about their background, their skills, their interests, and then provide a sample of their past work related to the position. And then we had them work on a project on site for a few hours as well. That was actually a project that team had worked on in the past month and was a particularly challenging, project that they had to solve. And the candidates then presented their work to the hiring managers within the context of that real world scenario that team had on their plate pretty recently. So as I'm debriefing with the hiring managers after, there's a senior manager and a junior manager, I had asked them, when you all were hired, what did that process look like? And it was very interesting to hear the responses. The senior manager was like, I've known somebody at the company for 15 years, and they called them up and was like, hey, I'm looking for a change. Do you have something for me? They ended up getting the job. All right. The junior manager, his experience was the senior manager had just called them up, and it was just a 2.5-hour phone call that was really open-ended, unstructured. And we had discussed, like, in that type of environment, it really lends itself well to the gregarious extrovert, right? And you sometimes fall into this trap of evaluating candidates based on their ability to engage in that small talk, build rapport, the quote unquote people skills, right?
So hiring based on vibes.
Correct. You're getting good vibes, exactly. And they had really appreciated this skill-based hiring model that we had put in and shared the feedback, like, we should do this with everybody. And that was ultimately the result of the hiring event, was they realized there isn't a lot of consistency between candidates, and that as they're evaluating folks, that could look very different from one candidate to another, and that having this replicable, scalable, and predictable system in place would help them have a better, again, system to be able to evaluate folks across the business. And that's what we ended up following up with them on, is we scheduled a skill-based hiring workshop so that we could teach them to create the projects like we had. And that's where we left things. So yeah, really good result in terms of 5 candidates getting hired when there was only supposed to be 4, as well as this appetite for skill-based hiring emerging at the company when they were able to see that the system works, rather than us having to sell them without having those wins in place. So
yeah, I find it interesting that they were so enthusiastic about adopting our methodology, especially because I think a lot of the unstructured and unstandardized practices that kind of evolve over time, whether it's hiring, whether it's annual reviews, whatever it may be, they come out of just like a lot of time passing and formality kind of falling away. And so you end up with a less structured process. And so their openness to change is a bit surprising. And I that's really encouraging. Did it feel like, I think our interview method can be as a big process change of very different than the traditional. And I think that's part of the goal here is to get rid of this, 2.5 hour vibes-based phone call, and swap it for something that is more structured, more skill focused. Did they have any feedback about how easy or difficult that change would be? It sounds like they were invested in it, but yeah, did they talk about what that process what might look like or how difficult it might be?
Sure. So yeah, we always do a manager prep call leading up to the hiring events. And I think during that call, there was this this vibe when you all are facilitating this, great, we'll participate. But if I was doing this myself, this would feel like wholesale change, reinventing the wheel. It might feel like a lot. But after they had actually walked through the process and participated, I think they had that moment where they realized this isn't necessarily reinventing the wheel. This is just a new default. And in their particular business unit, they were having some retention issues where they made some bad hires and those folks weren't retained. And I think they saw the value in it as well. Like, skill-based hiring isn't just more inclusive, it's more predictive, because they had no uncertainty leaving that hiring event that the candidate who received the offer had the skills that they needed on their team, because that candidate was able to show them those skills in action rather than having to sell themselves or tell them what skills that they had. So when they saw that full picture, I think time and cost-saving benefits came into clearer view by actually participating rather than just hearing this theoretical argument for skill-based hiring.
Okay, so having a guide through the process made it more attainable for them to take and own in subsequent iterations.
Correct. Yeah, that participation was really key. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm also a bit curious because some of the comparison that we drew was we were implementing this skill-based method for, I'm assuming, relatively entry-level or junior hires, but the comparison was with junior and senior managers and their experience being brought into the company at a higher level. Have you seen, or did they indicate any maybe different considerations that might come into play when making these kind of changes or implementing that kind of process, depending on the seniority level? Like, would it be universally applicable regardless?
Right. And I think we see this as well in terms of how folks are evaluated for promotions and how they're raising the ranks within an organization as well, because that was a big part of their culture. They called it train the trainer, right? So at some companies, there can be this hesitancy to tell everything you know to the folks who work on your team at a more junior level, because folks' egos get in the way and they kind of feel threatened, like in that type of scenario. But in this company, they were really big on, no, I'm going to give you everything that I know because I'm looking for that upward mobility in my next step myself, right? So I think in terms of that candidate persona that can be attractive in a behavioral style interview of that gregarious extrovert, those folks can also get promoted and rise the ranks in companies. So that same barrier from a promotion standpoint or from a hiring standpoint is addressed when, again, you have these concrete skills and criterias that you're looking for, you've defined on the front end, and then have a system in place to be able to determine to what extent this person is able to showcase those skills that are going to lead to success.
Mm-hmm. And so the overarching kind of takeaway is not just, hey, interview in this way. It's about looking at your systems and your processes that apply to everyone and trying to make them as consistent as possible. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, being deliberate about what you're looking for and what success looks like, rather than this very subjective type of analysis that can vary tremendously from one person to the next or one business unit to the next. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And a few other areas jump to mind for me and probably others as to where more consistency can be brought in. I know for me, what comes to mind is onboarding. Like, some teams have a plan for onboarding, and some teams have concepts of a plan for onboarding, and no real waypoints along the way, no specific mile markers or steps in any particular order that people are trying to find. I'm kind of sharing a worst case scenario at this point. And so I think that also is where we apply some of the same mindsets at looking at that as a process or as a system and saying, how do we create consistency? How do we create structure? Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And I think when you have this system in place, it saves you time as those moments come because you can refer back to it, right? So many folks are making it up as they go and trying to think about what it looks like onboarding, hiring, some of these other pieces that you had talked about. But when you have that sequence already plug and play ready to go, then it drives efficiency. There's going to be less miscommunication, less delays along the way through that candidate life cycle. And it's just a win-win for the candidate, the hiring manager, and the business when you add up all of those different barriers that get addressed through these systems.
Yeah, that is all very business relevant and practical. It's bringing to mind for me something a little off topic maybe, but maybe relatable. I feel like I have the same thought process when it comes to cooking, and I will make something that I really like, but I did it based on vibes. And then I look back and I'm like, I wish that I could do this next time, but I wasn't following a guide. I wasn't documenting my steps. And so the next time I have to try to recreate. And I think I've found myself in that same boat with onboarding, where it's like, I know what I did with employee A last year went well. They had a good experience. We got them onboarded smoothly. But if I wasn't following a guide and I couldn't look back and say, what was step one, what was step two, then I would have a hard time getting that same result. And just a couple other areas that come to mind for me where much like, what did I say, onboarding, the same thing could also apply to getting regularized feedback. I think that's something that we hear from a lot of employees and job seekers that we support is being able to know when feedback is coming so that, you're not kind of left out in the open or it's coming as a surprise. Like consistency in that aspect is also really key. We've heard that time and time again from folks that we support. Another that comes to mind for me is accommodations, both like what is made available and the process to access those accommodations. Those are, I think, two areas where, just like interviewing, the tendency towards entropy, towards losing consistency over time, really comes into play in both of those areas.
No, yeah, great points as well. Yeah.
So with all this in mind, we've talked about a few not case studies, but a few instances where consistency can be lacking and can be improved. If you were, working with a new client, here's this study and says like, yeah, I think that's something that we need. Where do you think is maybe the most accessible and impactful starting point to start looking at your systems, maybe one by one, so, that's chunked out and approachable. But yeah, where would somebody start to make these improvements?
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of skill-based hiring, this movement that's gained a lot of traction towards skill-based hiring is on a lot of employers' radars already. They're just not sure exactly what that's going to look like. We've seen a lot of emphasis placed on like, okay, in job descriptions, can we differentiate between what's a must-have and what's a nice-to-have? Do these educational requirements actually apply to the skills that we need for this role, these types of considerations. But in terms of how you're actually running your interviews, that's where there is still a gap that needs to be bridged in the marketplace, right? So I think a easy win is to, again, if you're working with a strategic partner, they can give you that little appetizer, which will then invite the managers to come back and purchase the whole meal, so to speak. Hopefully that metaphor is resonating.
Well, and by strategic partner, you mean someone like us that has done it, has a guide that you can follow. And by appetizer, you mean the iteration where we're hand-holding, we're implementing, and they're along for the ride. They get to see that it works. They get to see the benefit of it. And then it's that much easier to take it and own it and kind of buy into it yourself.
Correct. If you're in charge of creating the system and implementing without this proof of concept type of model, that can feel like a lot for one person to have to deliver for their team. But if you have this playbook or blueprint, so to speak, and it can be templated out, that is the level where you get that scale across different business units. You have success stories and you've seen it work before, and it can really cut out some of that trial and error and growing pains that may cause companies to hesitate when they're looking at pivoting towards skill-based hiring, even if they see that it's a trend and understand that the marketplace sees it as valuable.
Yeah. So skill-based hiring being a really impactful entry point, and then just like kind of gradually taking more ownership and implementing it more widely, then you start looking at those other areas, accommodations, onboarding, feedback, et cetera, to take the same consistency mindset and see where you can apply it elsewhere.
Correct. Yeah. Taking a step back and looking at a broader view of that talent acquisition lifecycle and being like, okay, if I'm in this candidate's shoes, what system again or process am I going to be plugged into from the point of your recruiting and screening me all the way to been fully onboarded and at a stable point with this company and contributing up to the level of my capabilities, right?
Yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned that kind of self-examination, looking at, what can we improve? When you're sitting kind of in the captain's chair of a process, that can be the hardest place to do that. Because a lot of times you're that senior manager that's been entrenched in vibes-based interviewing for 10 years or something. And I think in my practice, I've put a lot of emphasis on candidate or employee or whoever the stakeholder is getting feedback continuously to find out like what did or didn't work in the interview process, in the onboarding process, in your first year of employment, because that's where you're really going to see the pitfalls of your process. And hopefully before, there is a performance issue and we need to address something, that direly or urgently or whatever. But yeah, getting feedback I think is key to identifying and then taking action in the right place.
Right. Yeah. And that's what we heard from this partner, again, having the retention issues. They're like, this can really help us prevent the fire from happening rather than having to put the fire out after the fact.
Yeah. So, prevention. Yeah. Great. Okay, cool. Well, I think we've covered a lot. Great topic, widely applicable to, any kind of organization. If you have a process, it probably can be examined for consistency. So thanks for the example, Charles. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Sean.